Go the Duggin! My name's Terry, and I'm the Shieldmaiden in the kitchen. And I've been gone for a little while, so I'm glad to be back cooking for you today. But I've been busy teaching, learning, researching, writing, planning a new trip to Iceland, but also, very importantly, working with my friend and co-host CJ Adrian to create a new podcast. And so you can check us out on YouTube. It's called Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. And we've been having a good time talking with each other about the Vikings, but also interviewing some interesting guests to give you some different types of information about the Viking Age. And we've got lots more to come in store. But today, I'm going to get back to cooking finally, and I am going to share a recipe that has been a favorite in my house for a long time, and that is beef stew. And this is something for sure that would not have been unusual for Vikings or probably many medieval people. It's a very simple thing of, some meat and some vegetables and some broth in a pan and cook it over the fire or the gas stove, as it were, or actually the oven for what we're going to do today. And voila, you have a meal. I will also weave in, as I usually do, some Viking Age history, because this is an important way to talk about what a chieftain would have been doing in the Viking Age, particularly the earlier part of the Viking Age when those were the leaders. Before big strong kings came around in the later part of the period. But these men were important local leaders, but they had to create alliances with the other free farmers and free men who were in their communities and their districts. And in order to maintain their loyalty, they needed to be hospitable. And so that would have meant things like sharing the bounty of your table. So feasting was a big deal, and it was part of the political economy. And so, having alcohol and having meat available for your men and treating them to that was a way that you showed your magnanimity and maintained their support. And this episode, because of this particular topic, I'm going to dedicate to my friend Dr. David Zori at Baylor University, who has taught me much about what I know about the political economy of feasting in the early part of the Viking Age. And luckily all for you, in a few weeks, we will be interviewing David on our podcast. So you'll be able to hear from him directly about this a little bit more. But that being said, let's go ahead and get started with cooking. Okay, first things first, let's go over our ingredients, which are very simple and actually adaptable. You can add other things if you like, but for me, it's pretty simple to start with. And I will say just at the outset, this is, as I usually do, and I've said before, a recipe that I have had for a long time and that I have tweaked in various ways. But the original recipe came from Julia Child. And it's a simple meat, vegetable, wine, and broth sauce that is then sauteed and then baked, essentially, for several hours in order to get the meat nice and tender. But what we have is some chopped vegetables to begin with. So I've got, you can see some baby portobello mushrooms there that have been sliced, roughly a couple of cups worth. I have 2 cloves of garlic that have been chopped and 1 medium onion that has been chopped. And I used a white onion. You could use a yellow onion, a sweet onion, a red onion, whatever is to your taste. I also have 3 medium carrots that have been peeled and chopped here. We will then be adding 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes with the juice. This, of course, will be sauteed in olive oil. So there's our EVOO. Beef broth will be added as part of the liquid, but also a fair amount of wine, and it needs to be a full-bodied red wine. I have here a Zinfandel, which I like, but I've also used a Cabernet Sauvignon, and that works really well. So maybe either of the 2 of those, but whatever wine to your taste is fine, as long as it's a pretty full-bodied one. Heat the 2 tablespoons of olive oil on medium-high heat. And when it gets nice and heated up, you can begin to put in the chunks of meat. And what I want to do is just kind of brown those on all sides. The meat is browned. Now I'm going to just remove it to the bowl. Leave the juices in so that we can then move to sauteing the vegetables before mixing it all back together. This is a dish that's cooked in a couple of different ways. So we have this first step where we do the sauteing on the stove top. And then once everything is combined, we'll move it to the oven where it will bake for several hours, and that's where it, gets all of its flavor, and the meat becomes very tender because it's a sort of long, slow bake. And I have now begun the preheating of my oven to 300 degrees, and so it's going to be probably a 3-hour cook on this. But you'll see now all the meat is out, and I am going to add the carrots and also the onion. Need to put the camera down. Onion, garlic, and also the mushroom. We'll saute this also over medium-high heat for a few minutes until the onion and the mushrooms start to soften. Add a little bit of salt. And let that cook for just a few minutes. Sauteing nicely, beginning to sweat a little bit. I had added a little bit of salt. I've also added a little bit of black pepper just to taste. A sprinkling of dried thyme, probably amounted to maybe half a teaspoon, but that you can also do to taste. That's pretty much it. Very simple. Let this continue to cook. And as I usually do, talk a little bit about maybe what Vikings would have eaten. Definitely beef. We know that they farmed domestic animals like cattle and sheep, although keep in mind that beef are a little bit more intensive and they're larger animals, and so it's a little bit more resource heavy, and it would be somewhat expensive to have a very large herd of cattle. And this is one of the ways that definitely a chieftain could show their hospitality and their generosity, is by sharing beef, because it would have been seen as a more expensive item and a little bit more precious. So the other things that we have in here with carrots definitely can be grown in cold weather places like Scandinavia. Mushrooms they probably could get a hold of, definitely onions as well, those are common, and garlic, pretty much staples actually across medieval Europe, including in parts of Northern Europe. But again, this is the kind of dish that they could have added just about anything, and probably would have, depending on what they had available to them at the time. You'll notice that we don't have potatoes in our beef stew, and that's not for any reason necessarily that has to do with Vikings. It's just not part of this recipe. But also keep in mind too that potatoes really don't come into Europe until after the second wave of European expansion and colonialism, after the 14th and 15th century, because potatoes are not native to the European continent. And so we are going to be doing here a little bit more of a traditional kind of European dish based on what they would have had available to them in the Viking Age from the 8th to about the 11th century. Now that that has sauteed up a bit, and you can see it's wilting a bit, kind of fogging up my camera, I'm going to add 1 can of diced tomatoes. I use no salt added because I just tend to like to add salt to my own taste. I like salt and I do add salt, so it's not really an anti-salt or trying to be a low salt thing, but I just find I can control it better. So, and the juice is also added in there as well. And mix that up a bit. Now we can add the meat back. you'll see that it is big chunks of meat. And again, a little bit of fatty pieces on there, but of course this is going to make it so that it becomes much more tender once it cooks for a long period of time. I mean, certain cuts of meat you just can't do this with as much because maybe they aren't as marbled or fatty, and so they're just going to be tough. And so you really want to have, you know, these nice cuts of traditional beef stew meat, which tends to come from the fattier cuts of meat. All right, so you get all of that in there, and then we're going to add the wine. And again, I have a bottle of Zinfandel, but any full-bodied red wine will do. And because this cooks a long time and it also cooks out a lot of the alcohol as the flavor, you know, kind of intensifies and evaporates, you're going to use a lot of the wine. Generally, I use an entire bottle of wine and also then supplement with beef broth after that. The mixing of the two flavors makes it really good, but the wine, you know, creates this very nice deep flavor. And of course, you know, good full-bodied red wine always goes with beef. Now we cover that up so that it's pretty much just barely covered. Do you see there? That's the entire bottle of wine. But don't worry, you will not get drunk from eating this beef stew, I promise. All right, so once it's all covered like that, throw in that bay leaf, kind of mix it around just slightly. And that is really it. It is ready to be put in the oven. So put this down. Turn off our stove. And into the oven it goes. All right, and I usually will set a timer and then maybe every hour or so take a look at it, and because of the evaporation process, it is going to start to become a little bit concentrated. The flavors are going to deepen, but it means you also have to check to make sure it doesn't get too dried out, and then that's when I begin supplementing with the beef broth. So we will set a timer and we'll check back in a little bit. The timer just went off. 1 hour has passed, so we're going to take a look and see what we have. Smells good.
Sad we don't have smell-o-vision.
All right, looks just like it should. You can see it's starting to cook down a little bit. You can kind of tell by the line there as it's sort of shrinking in and evaporating a little bit, but it's a nice rich color. Stir it just a little bit. Woo! Steam. All right, and it looks like since it's only been an hour and it's still got plenty of moisture in there, we're not going to need to put any beef broth in there yet, but probably maybe the next time we check. So I'm going to set the timer for another hour and we will look again. Okay, another hour has passed, and so we're going to check and see how it looks. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. We've got a fair amount of liquid in there still. I am going to add just a little bit of beef broth. Kind of make sure everything keeps covered up. So not too much. This is actually going really well. And I will mention too, as you have no doubt noticed, that I am cooking this uncovered, and that is because we want the flavors to concentrate and we want some of that alcohol to evaporate out, and everything will cook down a little bit better without it being covered and trapping all of that moisture. So we are going to cook it for another hour, and then we'll be at 3 hours, and so we'll be able to see what we've got. But I did remember that I didn't say before when I was introducing all the ingredients that the main star of the show, right, is the beef actually. And so what I started with is 2 pounds of beef stew meat, which I had put some salt and pepper on and allowed to sit for just a few minutes so it can kind of absorb those seasonings before I began the browning process. So anyway, now you know. All right, we'll let this go for another hour and probably check back for our final time before we finish this off. All right, time's up. We've got 3 hours in on this, and I think we're really close to getting done. So here, let's take a look. All right, yes, that looks good. Nice, rich, dark brown color. And it has cooked down. Again, you can kind of see the ring around there as it has slowly evaporated out some of that liquid, hopefully deepening the flavor. So I'm going to take it out now and we will set it up here on top of the stove. And that's looking really good. I am going to turn on my gas here so that I can continue to kind of keep it cooking a bit on top of the stove. You'll see it's kind of coming to a little bit of bubbly boil there. So I'm going to turn it down actually to just kind of medium low. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to take this mixture here, which is equal parts 2 tablespoons of cornstarch and 2 tablespoons of water, just to make a slight thickening liquid. I'm doing it this way this time. I have in the past done it where I have made what's called a roux, which is equal parts butter and flour, and you mix that together. So if you want to have that kind of creamy texture, I guess, and also flavor from the butter, you can certainly do that as well as a thickening agent. But this time I'm going to just use the cornstarch instead and mix that in and let this kind of cook a little bit on the stove top, just to incorporate that and get it thickening up. So you'll be able to see there, sort of nice. And also, you know, the pieces of meat, when you bring them out, you can see how they kind of just, I can pinch it with the fork there and it just kind of pulls apart a little bit. So you can tell it's nice and tender. The last thing I'm going to do before I serve this is I'm going to add a little bit of green. I always like to have a little bit of green color, a little bit of vibrancy in foods like this, so it's not so beige, I guess, even though it has the carrots in there. And what I'm going to do is I have a little package of fresh peas, and so I will be adding this. You could also add maybe some pieces of green bean if you like, or even if you wanted some leafy green, you could certainly add like a spinach or some kale or something like that. But this time I'm going to add the peas and then let that cook for a little bit and we will be ready to serve. And there you have it, our finished beef stew, with the peas added for just a few moments to cook them and incorporate them in without overcooking them too much. And it's just a beautiful hearty meal, particularly on a winter's day like it is today where I'm at. And as you can see, it's really great to serve alongside a nice piece of bread. So now you know what it's like to be a Viking chieftain and offer the best that you have to offer. If you want to be a chieftain, then the way to people's hearts is through their stomachs. And so sharing generously from your table is a sure way to win friends and influence people and have warriors who will stay with you for life. So thanks again for joining me today. I was so happy to be back in the kitchen with you, and I will be back cooking some more things soon. But also in the meantime, please check out my new podcast with my friend CJ Adrian, Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. And you can learn a little bit more from our upcoming podcast with Dr. David Zori about feasting and the political economy in the Viking Age. But we've got other podcasts and other guests that are talking about and have talked about interesting things as well. So please join us there and join me in the future on Shieldmaiden in the Kitchen right here. And if you like what we're doing on both channels, please remember to like and share and subscribe. Thanks. Sjálfst.